in the late 1980s, the Soviet Union was a superpower on paper, but beneath the surface, the gears of its economy were grinding to a halt. Decades of central planning meant the government set every price, from steel beams to bread. But this system relied on a reality that was rapidly disappearing. To keep the peace, the Soviet state printed money to pay for failing factories and an oversized military. Because they weren't producing enough consumer goods, that extra cash just sat in bank accounts, waiting for goods that didn't exist. This was a ticking time bomb of pent-up inflation. When Mikhail Gorbachev introduced perestroika, or economic restructuring, the goal was to introduce market forces. Instead, it dismantled the old distribution system without building a new one. Factories were given more autonomy, but they didn't know how to sell in a competitive market. By 1991, the Soviet Union officially dissolved. Overnight, 15 new republics were left to fend for themselves. The central bank in Moscow still controlled the ruble, but every new country started printing their own versions or coupons to manage their local shortages, leading to total monetary chaos. In January 1992, the Russian government under Boris Yeltsin made a drastic move, shock therapy. They lifted price controls on almost everything. The government hoped prices would rise slightly and then stabilize, but they were wrong. Prices didn't just rise, they exploded. Hyperinflation hit with brutal force. In 1992 alone, inflation reached over 2,500%. A citizen who could buy a new car for their savings in January found that by December, that same amount of money wouldn't even buy a week's worth of groceries. The ruble became a currency that no one wanted to hold. People started bartering, trading shoes for flour or vodka for services. The formal banking system was effectively bypassed because money had lost its fundamental purpose as a store of value. During this period, the state-run enterprises were privatized in a process that came to be known as voucher privatization. Citizens were given vouchers to buy shares in companies, but desperate for cash, most sold their vouchers for pennies to a small group of well-connected insiders. This led to the rise of the oligarchs. Because the currency was worthless and state assets were being sold off for next to nothing, those with access to hard currency like the US dollar were able to buy entire industries, oil, metal, and media for a fraction of their value. By the mid-1990s, the Russian government tried to stabilize the ruble by pegging it to the US dollar, but the underlying economy remained weak. The government was spending way more than it was collecting in taxes, relying on high-interest short-term debt to keep the lights on. The house of cards collapsed in 1998. With commodity prices falling and investors fleeing emerging markets, Russia defaulted on its debt and devalued the ruble. The middle class, who had only just started to rebuild their savings, were wiped out for the second time in a decade. The lesson here is simple but harsh: a currency is only as strong as the economy behind it. Printing money doesn't create wealth, and removing controls in a system that lacks a legal framework for property rights often leads to the concentration of wealth, rather than a healthy, competitive market.